Hey guys, tonight we're wandering down streets that don't smell of fresh bread or roasted chestnuts, but of something far less romantic. Medieval alleys where perfume mixes with sewage, and shadows hide figures who have their own strange rituals of survival. You've clicked on a video that might make you wrinkle your nose, but don't worry, you probably won't survive this walk anyway, at least not with your dignity intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I always want this channel to feel like a sleepy corner of the internet where you can explore history's weirdest corners at your own pace. And if you're up for it, drop your location and the local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge along cobblestones slick with something you'd rather not identify. On one side, a candle flickers in the window of a bakery that shut hours ago, the faint ghost of bread barely clinging to the air. But that comfort is quickly overpowered by something sour, heavy, and disturbingly sweet all at once. The scent of people trying to cover rot with roses. Yes, perfume is everywhere here, splashed over bodies that haven't seen a true bath in weeks. You notice women waiting in corners, their gowns glimmering faintly in torchlight. They tilt their heads just so, releasing a whiff of musk, lavender, or rosewater, but it never quite wins against the background of open drains and chamber pots emptied from windows. Historians still argue whether medieval streets really smelled that bad, or if later writers exaggerated to make the past look grosser. But here in this narrow alley, your nose insists the truth leans toward the foul. One woman passes by, her perfume sharp enough to sting your eyes. She smiles, and you realize that the scent isn't just decoration, it's armor. In a world where soap is scarce and water often carries disease, perfume is the weapon of choice, masking what can't be washed away. Strangely enough, records show that perfumed oils imported from the East were so prized that even the poorest brothels tried to mimic the effect with cheaper substitutes. Sometimes steeping herbs in vinegar, sometimes even rubbing crushed flowers into sweat-stained sleeves. A quirky little detail. In some towns, local officials actually taxed prostitutes by the scent they wore. Imagine that, you're not fined for what you do but for how strongly you smell doing it. It sounds absurd, but think of it as medieval marketing. Fragrance was part of the product. And it tells you something about how customers judge the line between enticing and unbearable. As you keep walking, the ground beneath your shoes grows softer, not because of dirt, but because animal dung, food scraps, and human waste have been trampled into something resembling mud. It squelches when you step. You glance back at the women standing in doorways, and you wonder how they endure night after night, balancing elegance on a swamp of refuse. Some historians claim that prostitutes deliberately station themselves near sewers, because the constant stench actually dulled the sharper tang of unwashed bodies. It's a grim kind of camouflage, one that makes you laugh quietly to yourself. Only here could sewage be considered a kind of cologne. You look closer and you see little tricks. A sprig of rosemary tucked into a bodice. A pouch of herbs tied to a belt. These tiny sachets were more than decoration. They were medieval deodorant. Rosemary, lavender, even dried oranges when they could be found. The idea wasn't just to mask odor, but to ward off illness. People believed that sweet smells kept disease at bay, since sickness was thought to travel through bad air. The irony is almost comic. You're standing ankle-deep in filth, yet convinced that a whiff of lavender will protect you from the plague. There's a hum of voices ahead, and you realize you've wandered toward one of the busier streets where the line between tavern and brothel blurs. Ale sloshes in mugs, men shout half-hearted jokes, and through it all, the same cloud of competing perfumes drifts past. One of the women brushes by you, and the combination of sweat, roses, and stale wine is so thick you nearly cough. Still, she holds her head high, her perfume bottle clutched like a treasure. A fringe detail slips into your mind. Some of those little bottles weren't glass at all, but carved bone or wood. They hung from belts like charms, refilled with whatever scented oil could be afforded. Sometimes they held actual perfume, other times vinegar steeped with herbs. And occasionally, brace yourself, urine. Yes, you heard right. A whiff of ammonia was believed to cleanse foul air, and while it's debatable how often prostitutes really used it, a few scattered accounts suggest that desperate times led to desperate measures. It makes you think, how many tricks were lost to time? How many desperate measures were never recorded because they were too embarrassing to admit? You glance once more at the alley, the torches, the women who stand with forced smiles and fragrant armor, and you feel that uncomfortable blend of pity and fascination. Perfume becomes less about beauty here and more about survival. Another layer of makeup painted on a life that already wears too many masks. You follow the winding street a little further, and soon the air shifts from the sharp bite of perfume and refuses into something warmer, heavier, and oddly damp. There's steam curling out of a doorway, carrying with it the mingled scents of hot water, wood smoke, and a faint sweetness that makes you think of herbs, but also something more human and not in a flattering way. You've stumbled across one of the medieval bathhouses, places that were meant to promise cleanliness but ended up offering much more than soap. The sign above the entrance sways on rusty chains, carved with an image of a bucket and towel, but the chatter seeping through the walls tells you this is no ordinary washroom. Inside, men and women sink into wooden tubs side by side, the steam hiding most sins and revealing others. This is where hygiene and commerce blend together, scrubbing and seduction sold in the same package. You notice immediately that the laughter is louder than the splashing. Historians still argue whether bathhouses were truly centers of community hygiene, or thinly veiled brothels where the bathwater was just an excuse. You watch a woman slide gracefully into a tub already occupied by a merchant, her smile promising more than a rinse. The water itself is far from clean, murky, cloudy with oils and whatever had been washed off earlier customers, but no one seems to care. You settle into a corner, careful not to draw attention, and observe. The heat presses down on you like a blanket, and your skin prickles with sweat almost instantly. A serving boy passes by, dropping a handful of dried herbs into a cauldron so that the rising steam carries rosemary and thyme. It's supposed to smell refreshing, but the effect is halfway between a kitchen stew and a locker room. A quirky little fact comes to mind. Some bathhouses offered menus not of food but of fragrances. Clients could choose whether their water smelled of rose petals, chamomile, or even cinnamon if the bathhouse was especially wealthy. But the illusion rarely lasted long. Within minutes, the scent of warm bodies overtook everything, and the herbs sank forgotten to the bottom of the tub. One woman near you leans against the edge of her bath, her hair wet, her painted face already streaked by the humidity. She gestures to a man who hesitates, then slides into the tub beside her. You realize the room isn't arranged for modesty. There are no partitions, no curtains, just heat, sweat, and opportunity. For prostitutes, the bathhouse was the perfect stage. The act of washing could be turned into flirtation, the closeness of hot water a perfect excuse for touch. And the idea of cleanliness was part of the allure. You weren't just buying company, you were buying the illusion of a purified body, one that had been washed, scented, and made desirable again, if only for an hour. And yet the irony is thick. The water in these tubs was rarely changed between customers. Imagine dipping into a pool that's already seen a dozen strangers, carrying with them dirt, sweat, and whatever diseases the Middle Ages excelled at spreading. Some chroniclers even complained that bathhouses spread syphilis faster than taverns did. Still, people kept coming back because what was the alternative? A cold, filthy river? A trickle of water in a wooden basin at home? You catch the faint crack of laughter from another corner where two women splash each other playfully, their gestures exaggerated for the benefit of onlookers. It's performance as much as it is bathing. And if you squint, you realize that some of the tubs are less about water and more about wine. Yes, records mention that wealthy clients sometimes demanded tubs filled with wine or milk, both thought to improve the skin. Whether that's true or just a rumor inflated by gossip, historians still argue. But the idea of soaking in spoiled milk while whispering sweet nothings feels absurd enough to be believable. A serving girl passes with a tray of drinks, her own hands pruny from endless hours in damp heat. You wonder what it must be like to spend every day surrounded by steaming bodies, perfumes trying and failing to conquer the smell of mildew. Some bathhouses kept fires roaring constantly, so the entire building became a sweat lodge, a mixture of comfort and claustrophobia. And still people craved it. The bathhouse wasn't just for washing, it was for gossip, for business deals, and for prostitutes for survival. Another fringe detail tickles your mind. In certain towns, moralists tried to ban women from working in bathhouses at all, insisting that washing should remain separate from temptation. But the bans rarely worked. Too much money was at stake, and too many men preferred their bath with company. Regulations faded, and the steamy rooms went on just as before. You lean back, closing your eyes for a moment, and almost convince yourself that the heat is soothing. The rhythmic splash of water, the low murmur of voices, the faint sweetness of herbs, it could almost lull you, if not for the sharp reminder every time a wave slaps against the tub, carrying with it someone else's filth. You can't help but chuckle at the thought. Here you are, in a place where washing makes you dirtier, where perfume competes with sweat, and where the line between soap and sin is blurred beyond recognition. The steam fades as you step back into the night, but the scents cling stubbornly, herbs, sweat, and something faintly sour. Your nose is already weary, but the evening has only begun. Ahead, laughter rises from another cluster of houses, and you notice a different trick of survival. Mouths that smile a little too quickly, teeth that glimmer in the torchlight not because they're clean, but because they're coated in something floral and sweet. You edge closer, curious. One woman lifts a small flask and tips a clear liquid into her mouth, swirling it before spitting discreetly into the gutter. The sharp aroma reaches you, rosewater. A medieval luxury, imported from far-off gardens, but here it's not sprinkled over cakes or linens. Instead, it's used to chase away the swamp that lives inside the mouth. You realize that every smile you've seen tonight carries this same ghost of sweetness, a desperate attempt to veil what lies beneath. Historians still argue whether rosewater was genuinely accessible to poorer prostitutes, or if it was mainly a trick of the higher-end brothels. Some believe the cheaper women made their own substitutes, steeping petals in vinegar or even stale ale, creating rinses that were more about scent than sanitation. Whatever the truth, you can smell the effect, brief flashes of roses blooming in alleys that reek of sewage. But the illusion breaks quickly. When one of the women laughs too hard, you catch a glimpse of the truth. Teeth blackened at the edges, gums swollen, a faint metallic tang that no rose can fully disguise. Dental care in the Middle Ages was brutal at best, scraping with iron tools or pulling teeth entirely when pain grew unbearable. For those who sold kisses, though, hiding decay became part of the trade. A quirky little tidbit drifts to mind. Tooth powders were sometimes made from crushed eggshells, burnt bread, or even powdered brick mixed with salt. Imagine scouring your teeth with sandpaper every morning. The result wasn't dazzling enamel but a mouthful of scratches, bleeding gums, and even faster decay. Still, to rub something gritty across your teeth felt like progress, and sometimes that was enough. You pause by a doorway where a woman with carefully curled hair leans forward, whispering to a passing soldier. Her lips are painted faintly red, probably crushed berries mixed with fat, but when she smiles the effect falters. The teeth behind the paint are jagged, uneven, survivors of too many makeshift remedies. And yet, she knows the trick of timing. Laugh quickly, tilt your head just so, keep the sweet rosewater breath close to the client's nose and away from the evidence. It's a performance as delicate as theater. The debate among scholars flickers in your mind. Was rosewater really about hygiene, or was it closer to magic? Some chroniclers describe women using it in rituals, washing their mouths not just to smell sweet, but to ward off disease. People believed that illness spread through miasma, corrupted air, and that a mouth that smelled like roses could actually repel sickness. The science was wrong, but the faith was unshakable. As you walk deeper into the quarter, you catch snippets of other attempts at oral care. A woman chews parsley, another gnaws a clove, both releasing scents sharp enough to trick the unwary. Garlic was also common, though less for seduction and more for protection. The belief went that chewing garlic before meeting a client could ward off disease, though you imagine the poor man on the receiving end wasn't as charmed by the halitosis. Still, in a world where risk was constant, cloves and garlic became as important as perfume. Another fringe practice floats through your thoughts, one recorded in odd little notes by medieval physicians. Urine mouthwash. Yes, truly. Some insisted that the ammonia in urine whitened teeth and killed infection. Whether prostitutes ever actually used it is a matter of heated debate, but the rumor alone was strong enough to stain their reputation. You imagine someone swishing that acrid liquid around while praying that roses could mask the aftermath. You pause under a lantern, noticing how the flame illuminates the mouths of those around you. Smiles that look radiant from a distance collapse into ruin up close. Yet the women still laugh, still lean forward with practiced ease, because in this business, confidence mattered as much as cleanliness. They learned to wield scent as a shield, timing their breath, controlling the angle of light, hiding the truth behind rosewater mist. The smell of roses lingers on your clothes as you move away, but underneath it, a faint metallic tang remains. You realize you've just inhaled the perfume of desperation, sweet at first, sour when it fades, clinging long after the moment has passed. You can't help but chuckle softly, wondering what future historians will say about our own attempts to mask reality with mint gum and whitening strips. Maybe they'll laugh at us the same way we laugh at rosewater gargles in alleys reeking of sewage. The rosewater fades as you wander on, but the sound of laughter drifts back toward you, mingling with the faint scratching noise of something less pleasant. You turn your head and there it is, the real plague of medieval life, hair that moves even when the wind is still. Wigs, disguises, and 1,000 little legs. You notice one woman tilt her head toward a torch to show off a cascade of golden curls. The light dances across her hair, catching each strand like spun fire, but something about the fit is off. The wig perches too high, the line of her real scalp hidden under cloth. You squint, and just for a moment you think you see the tiniest flicker, lice darting through seams bold as any client. Historians still argue whether wigs were more common among prostitutes or among the wealthy who tried to hide baldness from disease. But what's clear is that wigs served double duty in this world. They were masks, quick disguises that let a woman transform from a brunette peasant to a golden-haired temptress in minutes. And they were shields, covering shorn heads when lice infestations forced drastic measures. In an age where baths were rare and combs less than effective, shaving the head was often the only real solution. You lean against a wall, watching as another woman removes her headdress, slipping out a dark wig and replacing it with a lighter one in a single practiced motion. The effect is startling. One moment she looks like the girl next door, the next she is exotic, mysterious, perhaps even foreign. In a business where novelty sold, wigs were as essential as perfume. A quirky tidbit makes you smirk. Some wigs were lined with small sachets of herbs, meant to mask not just the smell of sweat but the movement of lice themselves. Rosemary, lavender, even wormwood, all stuffed under the hair like invisible guards. Of course they rarely worked. The lice were relentless, crawling out at the most inopportune moments. Imagine trying to flirt while scratching your scalp like a dog. One woman nearby laughs too loudly and lifts her curls to scratch beneath, leaving her wig slightly askew. You stifle a chuckle. It's both comic and sad. The illusion works only if no one looks too closely. From a distance, the hair is radiant. Up close, the seams, the powder, and the occasional unwelcome movement betray the truth. And then there's the disguising power of wigs. Police and church officials often patrolled the streets, eager to fine or punish women of the night. A wig could mean the difference between recognition and escape. Dark hair became light, curls became braids, and with a quick twist of fabric, an outlaw became invisible. Some historians even claim that wigs helped prostitutes slip past curfews, reappearing under new guises in other quarters of the city. Fringe practices go even deeper. There are accounts, though debated, that wigs were sometimes dusted with powders made of crushed ashes or chalk. Not just for color but to choke out lice. The idea was simple: suffocate the pests with dust. The result? Hair that looked pale, flaky, and ghostly but at least a little less itchy. You pause as one woman adjusts her wig and leans into a soldier, whispering promises. He strokes her curls as though they were real, smiling at the illusion. And you realize that's the key. Wigs weren't just about hiding lice or changing color. They were theater props. Tools of reinvention in a trade where every night demanded a new mask. And yet, as you glance back at the woman scratching furiously behind her ear, you can't help but laugh under your breath. No matter how many disguises they donned, the tiny armies of lice always won. In that sense, the wigs were almost honest. They showed that beauty here was always a fragile trick, glitter painted over rot, curls perched over an itchy scalp. You step away, and the faint scratching seems to follow you down the street, like the echo of 1,000 restless legs. It makes your own scalp tingle in sympathy, and you shake your head with a wry smile. Tonight you've learned that seduction could be as simple as swapping a wig, and as complicated as hiding the itch beneath it. The scratching fades into the distance, but another spectacle quickly takes its place. You pause under the faint glow of a lantern and notice faces that gleam in ways no torchlight could ever produce naturally. Pale, smooth, ghost-like, cheeks powdered until they look carved from wax, lips tinted with unnatural fire. This isn't nature, this is invention. You've stepped into the strange, dangerous world of medieval makeup. One woman tilts her chin toward you and her skin glows white, almost too perfect against the shadows. For a heartbeat, she seems radiant, otherworldly. But then the torch flickers differently and you see the truth. The chalky dust clings unevenly, caked into creases, with faint streaks where sweat has begun to break through. Still, the illusion is strong enough to snare a distracted glance, and sometimes that's all that's needed. The recipes for this kind of beauty were less art than alchemy. Lead powders, chalk, ashes, ingredients pulled from kitchens, hearths, and even apothecaries. Mixed with vinegar or egg whites, they became paints that promised glamour but delivered poison. Historians still argue whether women knew how dangerous lead-based powders were, or whether vanity and survival outweighed suspicion. Some chroniclers hint that prostitutes were among the heaviest users, needing to refresh their faces nightly, regardless of the toll it took on their skin beneath. You lean closer to the group and notice the faint shimmer of rouge on one woman's cheeks. It isn't a soft blush, it's harsh, almost scarlet. The source? Burnt safflower petals, sometimes wine dregs, occasionally even animal blood mixed with fat. The goal was always the same: to trick the eye into seeing youth, vitality, and warmth, even if exhaustion and illness were lurking under the surface. Here's a quirky detail to amuse you. One recipe for rouge called for mixing crushed mulberries with hog's grease. Imagine dabbing your cheeks with a potion that smelled faintly of farmyard and jam. The result was sticky, bright, and stubborn enough to survive hours of candlelit labor. It makes you chuckle to think of a client leaning close, inhaling roses on the breath but bacon on the cheeks. The lips were no safer. Painted red with mixtures of ochre and beeswax, or darkened with ashes and wine. One fringe practice, debated among historians, involved using mercury-based pigments to add sheen. Mercury, another slow poison, silently eroding the body even while making it shimmer. You imagine women watching their faces in dull bronze mirrors, marveling at their radiance, never connecting the beauty to the tremors and sickness that followed years later. And yet, the transformation was irresistible. In a world where dirt was normal, powdered skin and painted lips turned heads. Pale faces signaled leisure, an ironic claim for women who worked longer hours than most, but the illusion was powerful. A pale, powdered cheek suggested a lady, someone too refined to labor in fields. And that illusion, sold for the right price, could make all the difference between hunger and survival. You catch a moment of comedy too. One woman sneezes and a puff of white dust rises from her face, settling onto her wig. She laughs, fanning herself with a ragged glove, and quickly reapplies a dab of powder from a tiny pouch. The act is so practiced it feels like second nature. Beauty wasn't a one-time effort, it was a constant battle waged between sweat, powder, and candlelight. And candlelight itself was the conspirator. These faces weren't designed for sunlight. Under the harsh eye of day, the cracks, streaks, and pallor would be obvious. But in the dim glow of torches and tallow candles, powders softened, rouges bloomed, and eyes shimmered like jewels. It was stage lighting centuries before the theater learned the trick. Another tidbit drifts into your thoughts. Some prostitutes rubbed their faces with egg whites, letting them dry into a shiny film. Under candlelight, it gave the illusion of smooth, glowing skin. But the sensation? Tight, sticky, and prone to cracking if you dared to smile too wide. You picture someone grinning, only to feel their youthful mask split like a drying mud pie. And then, of course, there's the dark irony. The very substances that created allure, lead, mercury, ashes, were quietly poisoning their users. Slowly, imperceptibly, beauty was traded for sickness. Yet in these alleys, survival demanded risk. To look desirable for one more night mattered more than a decade of hidden damage. You step away, the chalky image of painted faces burned into your memory. They smile, they laugh, they shine under candlelight, but beneath the powders lies skin weary, irritated, slowly ruined. It's a mask, both literally and figuratively, painted on anew each evening. You can't help but smirk at the absurdity. Here, beauty comes in a bottle that kills you softly, and yet it remains irresistible because without it, there would be no clients, no coins, no chance of another tomorrow. You've already seen wigs scratched raw and faces painted with poisons, but now your attention shifts to something that feels even stranger. The smell of sweat, carried not with shame, but almost with pride. In a world where water was feared, soap was scarce, and perfume was expensive, the scent of sweat itself sometimes became perfume. You pause at the edge of a tavern doorway. Inside, the air is thick, ale, smoke, roasting meat, and the unmistakable tang of human bodies packed too tightly. Yet the women here don't shrink from it. Instead, they lean into their own heat, brushing shoulders with soldiers, letting sweat roll down their necks like a glistening jewel. One woman laughs as a man presses close, and you realize that her scent, ripe, heavy, undeniably human, is part of the game. Historians still argue whether medieval people were truly immune to the smell of each other, or if they simply learned to reinterpret it. What you might consider an automatic turn-off today could, in those days, signal vitality. A strong-smelling body meant you were alive, healthy enough to sweat, filled with heat and energy. Some physicians even praised sweat as a sign that the body was purging itself of sickness. You picture a medieval doctor patting someone on the back and saying, "You stink. That means you're healthy." And prostitutes, always resourceful, found ways to weaponize this belief. Instead of fighting sweat with constant washing, which was impractical and sometimes considered dangerous, they enhanced it. A dab of rose water on the wrists, a sprig of rosemary in the bodice. These weren't meant to erase odor, but to frame it, like adding a garnish to an already strong dish. A quirky detail surfaces. Some women rubbed their armpits and groins with musk, an animal-derived scent so pungent it made eyes water. When mixed with natural body odor, It created an intoxicating cocktail that some clients swore by. Musk was expensive, so cheaper brothels mimicked it with fermented herbs or even strong-smelling cheeses tucked into cloth. Yes, imagine leaning close to someone and smelling a faint whiff of camembert passed off as seduction. You chuckle at the absurdity, but the logic is clear. In the dim glow of taverns, after hours of ale and dice games, subtlety wasn't required. What mattered was intensity. If the air itself was thick with sweat, smoke, and spice, the scent of a body, ripe and immediate, fit right in. Another fringe practice, debated among historians, was the deliberate cultivation of sexual sweat. Some accounts describe women dancing wildly before clients arrived, working themselves into a sheen of heat. The smell of sweat mixed with perfume wasn't a shame to be hidden, but proof of passion, a living signal that the woman before you was full of life. Whether this was widespread or just scandalized gossip, no one can say for certain. But you can almost imagine the scene. The candlelight, the laughter, the shimmer of damp skin. You lean back against the tavern wall, watching as a woman fans herself slowly, drawing attention to the glistening hollow of her throat. Her powdered face may be cracking, her wig may itch, but the sweat makes her glow in its own way. Clients don't turn away, they lean closer, intoxicated not by roses or lavender, but by the undeniable proof of a warm, living body. The irony, of course, is that real cleanliness was always just out of reach. Bathhouses spread disease, rivers were filthy, and soap was a luxury item. Sweat became the constant companion, unavoidable, so the clever turned it into a tool. Instead of apologizing for it, they sold it. And yet, you can't help but laugh softly at the thought. In this world, what you desperately try to scrub away with deodorant and shower gel today might once have been your greatest asset. You wonder half seriously what modern dating would look like if natural sweat were once again marketed as irresistible. Probably fewer perfumes at the mall, and more people jogging before first dates. You step back into the night air, which is somehow fresher but still heavy with lingering odors. You've seen perfume used as armor, wigs used as masks, makeup used as poison, and now sweat turned into perfume. Each trick feels stranger than the last, yet all of them share the same truth. In a world where true hygiene was out of reach, survival meant turning flaws into features, filth into allure. You wander further down the street, and the torchlight catches folds of fabric swinging from a doorway. At first it looks elegant, silks or velvets swaying in the night breeze, but as you draw closer the illusion frays. The dresses are stiff, crusted, heavy with unseen histories. These aren't gowns that glide, they're costumes that carry the weight of weeks without washing. One woman steps toward you, her bodice tight, her skirt rustling like parchment. It doesn't take much imagination to know why. Laundry was not a nightly task here, it was a luxury. Water was hard to heat, soap expensive, and washing a gown meant hours of labor. Most women owned only one or two dresses, and those were worn until they practically walked away on their own. Historians still argue about just how filthy these garments grew. Some claim women tried to keep them fresh with herbs and smoke, while others insist that layers of filth were simply tolerated as the price of survival. Either way, you can see the truth. These dresses weren't just clothing. They were tools, shields, even secret storage. You notice a seam slightly bulging, and the woman casually slips a hand inside, retrieving a coin pouch hidden in the lining. Dresses doubled as safes, stitched with pockets to keep hard-earned coins away from pickpockets, or sometimes even from employers skimming profits. The fabric might stink, but it guarded what mattered most. Here's a quirky little tidbit. Some dresses were lined with straw or rags to pad them out. Not just for warmth, but to absorb sweat and filth. Imagine carrying your own compost pile around your waist. The padding was rarely washed. Instead, it was replaced when it became unbearable, which could take weeks. Until then, the smell followed like a second shadow. And yet, clothing also played defense. Tight bodices made it harder for drunk or aggressive clients to strip a woman against her will. Heavy skirts, weighed down by grime and fabric, could be swung as makeshift shields in alleys where danger lurked. One woman passes by, clutching her skirts in both hands as though ready to lash out, and you suddenly see her gown less as costume, more as armor. The debate among scholars grows amusing here. Some argue that prostitutes wore deliberately gaudy, even dirty clothing as a badge of their trade, an obvious signal to clients and officials alike. Others believe they did everything possible to mimic the fashions of wealthier women, only to be betrayed by the smell and stiffness of their clothes. Either way, the gown became a paradox, an advertisement of allure and a billboard of filth. You watch as a group of women gather near a tavern door, their skirts brushing the ground. Each swish releases a puff of odor, Ale, sweat, smoke, worse. Still, the gowns shimmer faintly in the dim light, dusted with cheap powders or stitched with a few bright threads. Beauty and squalor stitched together, inseparable. A fringe practice pops into mind: fumigation of clothing. In some towns, women were known to hang their gowns over smoldering herbs or burning pine resin. The smoke would drive away lice and cover odors, leaving the dress reeking of campfire instead of sewage. It wasn't washing exactly, but it was survival. You can almost picture it: a circle of dresses swaying over smoking pots, women laughing through the haze, joking that they'd become walking incense. One woman passes you, and the air she leaves behind is sharp, sour, yet oddly human. Her gown clinks faintly. You realize she's hidden a flask in the folds, perhaps as much a weapon as a drink. The fabric carries everything: stains, secrets, sometimes even knives. Each dress is its own archive, recording weeks of survival in smells, colors, and textures. You smile wryly, thinking of your own closet, of clothes tossed in the wash after a single day. Here, that would be laughable. Each garment is more than clothing. It's a partner in the trade, stiff with dirt but strong enough to hold coins, protect bodies, and disguise shame. You take one last look at the heavy skirts swaying in the torchlight, and you realize they tell the same story as everything else tonight: beauty painted over filth, survival stitched into every seam. You step into the glow of a crooked lantern hanging outside a cramped tavern, and suddenly the street feels louder, hotter, more crowded. The doors creak open, and the smell hits you like a wall: ale gone sour, smoke from damp firewood, sweat soaking into benches that haven't been scrubbed in months. You're not in a nobleman's feasting hall. This is the working-class tavern, where prostitutes and their clients mingle in a blur of candlelight, spilled beer, and whispered negotiations. Inside, the air feels thick, and you notice that water plays almost no part in the cleaning of this room. Floors are rarely washed. Instead, straw is scattered to soak up urine, vomit, or spilled drink, replaced only when it becomes unbearable. You can feel the crunch beneath your shoes. Prostitutes here didn't dine like ladies. They slurped ale, tore bread with their hands, and wiped greasy fingers on skirts already stiff with use. One woman tilts her cup back, ale spilling down her chin, and you see how the alcohol does more than quench thirst. It numbs her, dulls the stink, loosens her laughter. Historians still argue whether prostitutes preferred taverns because they offered work, or because the drink was a necessity for surviving the work. Either way, this dim, noisy place became a second home. The mainstream fact here is simple: taverns doubled as brothels across much of medieval Europe. Some were officially licensed, taxed by towns that saw no reason to lose profit on vice. Others operated in shadows, where back rooms served for quick encounters while the front filled with the clatter of mugs. The overlap was so common that some city councils referred to taverns as unofficial houses of ill repute. A fringe tidbit makes you raise an eyebrow: tavern wine was often watered down to increase profit, but sometimes it was seasoned with herbs meant to dull desire, just enough to keep men docile. Of course, no one asked the women if they enjoyed serving drugged patrons. You picture a woman rolling her eyes as another client slumps across the table, too dazed to finish his sentence. The heat grows unbearable, so the tavern mistress orders the shutters thrown wide. The night breeze carries away some smoke but also invites in new stenches from the street. The women don't seem to mind, they're too busy working the room. You watch one pull a sprig of rosemary from her bodice, chew it quickly, then lean in close to a customer. The herb won't mask much, but in this world of sour wine and stale bread, even a hint of freshness feels like luxury. Historians debate how much tavern life blurred the line between leisure and labor. Were these women seeking clients, or simply finding companionship among the noise? Some argue that prostitutes gathered here for protection, watching each other's backs in rowdy crowds. Others insist the tavern was a hunting ground, where every spilled drink might lead to a transaction. Standing here, you suspect both are true. As you drift toward the back of the room, the sound changes. The laughter thins, replaced by muffled whispers. A door creaks, and you catch a glimpse of shadowy stairs leading upward. Rooms above the tavern were rented cheaply, beds barely more than straw pallets. Sheets, if they existed, were rarely washed. Women and clients alike knew the risks but accepted them. Better a dirty bed than no bed at all. One quirky scene unfolds before your eyes. A drunk patron collapses mid-song, sliding under the table. Without missing a beat, a woman deftly lifts his purse, drops a coin into her shoe, and nudges him awake with her foot. The tavern erupts in laughter, as if theft were just another form of entertainment. Survival here isn't delicate. It's clever, sometimes cruel, but always practical. The fire sputters in the hearth, smoke stinging your eyes. A jug crashes to the floor. Somewhere upstairs, you hear the squeak of old boards under hurried footsteps. And through it all, you realize the tavern is not just a place of filth and drink. It's a stage where survival is performed nightly, each woman juggling charm, resilience, and exhaustion. You step back into the night, your clothes now heavy with smoke. The tavern fades behind you, but its atmosphere clings. Sour ale, laughter edged with desperation, and the stubborn will to keep living one more day. The night air outside the tavern is damp, heavy with wood smoke drifting from nearby chimneys. You walk a little farther down the street and stumble onto a different kind of establishment, not the noisy tavern but a cramped bathhouse. At first, you expect steam, soap, and relief. Instead, you find a space that feels equal parts medical ward and meeting hall, buzzing with the awkward intimacy of half-naked strangers. The bathhouse is built of timber, its planks darkened by years of humidity. A sour-sweet odor greets you before you even step inside, like wet wool left too long in the rain. The floors are slick, the walls damp, and the water in the central tubs looks cloudy under candlelight. This is where prostitutes sometimes came to wash, though the word wash feels overly generous. A mainstream fact helps you orient yourself. In many European cities, bathhouses doubled as brothels. Authorities knew it, patrons knew it, and so did the women who worked here. Washing and sex blurred into the same transaction, wrapped together in steam and whispers. You can imagine a man convincing himself that a visit here improved his health, even as he emerged smelling more of herbs than cleanliness. But here's the quirky tidbit: soap as we know it wasn't standard in these bathhouses. Instead, women rubbed their skin with mixtures of bran, ashes, or crushed herbs, all meant to scrape away grime. Some bathhouses even advertised healing muds that supposedly cured ailments. Whether that was clever marketing or genuine belief, historians still argue whether these treatments had any real effect or just left clients with sticky skin. The steam rises thick as you move between the wooden partitions. A group of women huddle near a tub, hair pinned up with bone combs, their laughter echoing off the wet walls. They pour pitchers of lukewarm water over each other, scrubbing quickly before the heat fades. Privacy is scarce. This is communal cleansing. You feel the mix of camaraderie and discomfort. Laughter hiding exhaustion, routine masking the risk of infection. And yes, infection is everywhere. Shared water meant shared illness. Skin rashes, lice, and worse traveled from body to body under the guise of bathing. Still, the bathhouse remained popular, partly because it was one of the few places where prostitutes could warm themselves in winter, soothe sore muscles, and share gossip without the eyes of the street constantly upon them. Historians debate whether prostitutes truly used bathhouses for hygiene or if the appeal was social. Were these gatherings practical, an attempt to keep disease at bay, or more about solidarity in a dangerous profession? Looking at the easy chatter around the tub, you sense both. Soap may have been absent, but companionship was abundant. The herbal oils return in this setting too. Women sometimes carried small vials of lavender, thyme, or rosemary oil, not only to rub into their hair but also to disguise the smell of murky bathwater. A quick dab on the wrist might trick a client into thinking he'd met someone fresh, even if the water itself was anything but. You picture one woman smirking as she dips her fingers into a jar of mint oil, then lightly taps it on her throat before stepping back into the street. And the water, always the water. The tubs are rarely drained between groups. Instead, attendants skim the surface with wooden ladles, removing stray hairs or floating bits of straw, before ushering in the next set of bathers. The illusion of cleanliness is maintained, but you're left imagining just how many bodies shared the same murky bath on a busy night. A little joke sneaks into your thoughts. If you ever feel bad about reusing yesterday's coffee cup, just remember these women sometimes reused yesterday's bathwater. Suddenly that cup doesn't seem so offensive. You move toward a smaller side room where the air feels cooler. Here, clients are sprawled out on benches, waiting for women to finish their ablutions. The atmosphere shifts, quieter, more intimate, as if the steam has muted the world outside. A transaction here might begin with a splash of water on the shoulders, a cloth rubbed across the chest, and then, without much pause, it turns into something less about bathing and more about bargaining. One last odd detail lingers as you leave. Some bathhouses offered flavored wines to refresh the spirit, spiced with cinnamon or cloves. The idea was to sweeten the taste in the mouth after the bitter smoke and murky water. But more often than not, the strong spices only masked the sourness of cheap, badly stored drink. Again, illusion over reality. Stepping back into the cold night, you notice your own clothes cling with moisture, as though you've carried the bathhouse steam with you. And in a way you have, Its atmosphere of murky water, desperate rituals, and fleeting warmth lingers, a reminder that in the Middle Ages cleanliness was less about being clean and more about surviving appearances. You leave behind the steamy air of the bathhouse, but the echoes of laughter and splashing water cling to you as you walk deeper into the town. The cobblestones are damp, the moonlight silvering their uneven surfaces. Ahead, the street narrows and a faint trail of smoke guides you toward a different gathering place, the home of a midwife where prostitutes sometimes went not to clean themselves, but to repair their bodies after nights of work. This room is small and dim, lit by a single oil lamp. Herbs hang in bundles from the rafters, their shadows stretching like long fingers across the walls. The air is pungent with sage, rue, and garlic, plants believed to protect against disease and evil spirits. The midwife, a woman with creased hands and sharp eyes, moves quietly among bowls, cloths, and jars of murky liquid. Here you encounter another hygiene practice: fumigation. Prostitutes would sit over steaming pots of herbs, skirts tented around them, as smoke and vapor were thought to cleanse the body and drive out bad humors. You picture a woman shifting uncomfortably on a stool, eyes watering from the fumes, while the midwife murmurs that this ritual would keep her healthy. Whether it truly helped or simply created an illusion of purification, no one can be certain. But the smell alone was powerful enough to convince. Some midwives also offered vinegar washes, believed to prevent disease after sex. Vinegar was sharp, cheap, and easy to obtain. Bowls of it sat ready on wooden tables, next to scraps of cloth. Women would soak strips, then wipe themselves briskly, grimacing as the sting hit raw skin. You can almost hear the hiss between their teeth, a sharp exhale that mixes pain with relief. Modern science tells us vinegar does little against infection, but in a world without antibiotics, hope was often more valuable than truth. There's an almost heartbreaking practicality to these rituals. A woman couldn't afford weeks of sickness, she couldn't risk losing her only source of income. So fumigation, vinegar washes, and pungent ointments became survival strategies, half medicine, half superstition. A quirky detail makes you pause. Some prostitutes carried tiny pouches of dried herbs, wormwood, rosemary, or lavender, sewn into their skirts. These pocket charms were meant to ward off disease, but they also served as natural deodorants. Imagine a woman leaning close to a client, the faint fragrance of lavender rising from her clothing, masking sweat and smoke. It wasn't perfume as we know it, but it was a small attempt at dignity. The midwife's table holds another odd remedy: powdered alum. Mixed with water, it created an astringent wash that tightened skin temporarily. It was marketed as a way to appear fresh, a cruel trick of chemistry and commerce. You imagine the desperation behind using such a powder, the way women clung to anything that might give them an edge in a profession where appearances meant survival. Historians argue over whether these practices actually worked. Some suggest the vinegar and alum may have offered minimal protection. Others believe they did more harm than good, irritating the body and leaving women more vulnerable. The truth may lie somewhere in between, but what matters here is not the science but the ritual, the sense of control these women gained by performing them. A moment of humor creeps in as you notice one jar labeled with a scrawled cure-all recipe: garlic boiled with wine mixed with honey and rubbed on the skin. The smell alone would drive away more than disease, it might drive away half the town. Still, in desperate times, who could laugh too hard at an attempt to feel safe? You watch as a young woman dips a rag into vinegar, wrings it out, and hands it to another with a resigned shrug. They share a quick laugh, half amusement, half exhaustion. The laugh feels almost medicinal in itself, a reminder that even in the most precarious circumstances, humor can be a form of hygiene too, washing the spirit if not the skin. When you step back outside, the night feels colder, sharper. The smell of vinegar and herbs clings to your imagination. You realize that hygiene for these women wasn't just about physical cleanliness, it was about protection, performance, and survival. The midwife's remedies may not have cured much, but they offered hope. And sometimes in the medieval world, hope was the only medicine available. The night deepens as you wander further, and the alleys grow quieter. The air is still, heavy with the scent of smoke and sewage, and you begin to notice another truth about medieval life. Noise wasn't the only thing prostitutes had to endure. Smell was just as relentless. You step into a courtyard where several women gather, not to wash, not to heal, but simply to mask the stench of their work in their world. They dab at their faces with linen cloths dipped in rose water. The fragrance is faint, a whisper against the stronger backdrop of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and animal dung. You notice how carefully they apply it, patting the cheeks, brushing it over the forehead, sometimes pressing the cloth briefly to the armpits. It is a small act of grace in a place that rarely allowed for dignity. Perfumed oils come next. A flask is passed around, the cork stained dark from years of use. A few drops of oil are rubbed into hair, wrists, or along the neckline of a dress. The oil glistens in the candlelight, but its true purpose is disguise. It hides the lingering musk of sweat, the sour trace of sickness, and the smoky reek of taverns. You watch as one woman leans toward another, sniffing playfully and declaring the scent better than last week. They both laugh, and for a moment the air feels lighter. A curious detail stands out here. Some perfumes were made not only from flowers but from musk, civet, or ambergris, animal-based ingredients that smelled earthy and pungent. In the dim spaces of medieval taverns, such strong odors weren't considered unpleasant. They suggested vitality, even allure. Imagine the strange collision of scents: garlic breath mingling with rose water, sweat laced with musk, wine-soaked clothing perfumed with lavender. For the modern nose, it would be overwhelming, but in that world it was simply part of the atmosphere. Not all women could afford imported oils. Some used crushed herbs instead. Mint leaves rubbed between fingers, rosemary twigs tucked into braids, or sage burned briefly and fanned through clothing. These were the perfumes of the poor, ephemeral, natural, and fleeting. You imagine a woman entering a room with sprigs of rosemary tied to her bodice, offering a whiff of freshness before it fades into the background stink of medieval life. Historians still argue whether perfumes were primarily for personal pleasure or professional necessity. Some suggest that prostitutes used them to attract clients, promising a sensory experience above the ordinary. Others argue the scents were mainly for themselves, a way to reclaim a fragment of humanity in a world that treated them as commodities. Perhaps both are true, intertwined in the same ritual act. And then there's a fringe tidbit. In certain towns, women were rumored to chew cardamom seeds or anise before kissing clients, a primitive form of breath freshener. The seeds didn't just sweeten the mouth, they also symbolized health and vitality. Imagine the little crack of anise between teeth, the brief burst of licorice-like flavor, followed by a coy smile. It's oddly charming, proof that even in the roughest corners of history, people cared about the same small details we obsess over today. Of course, these attempts at masking were temporary. By morning, the rose water would fade, the oil would grow rancid, and the herbs would crumble into dust. But the ritual itself carried meaning. It wasn't just about hygiene, it was about stepping into a role, preparing the body like an actor dressing for stage. When a prostitute dabbed on rose water, she wasn't just hiding odor, she was layering on identity, crafting a version of herself that could endure the night. A joke drifts through your thoughts as you watch one woman rub garlic on her chest for strength, before sprinkling lavender on top to hide it. You think, medieval perfume must have been the world's first cologne combo pack. Fight off disease and smell irresistible. By the time you step away, the courtyard feels like a theater of scents, fragile, fleeting, but fiercely human. In a world where cleanliness was scarce, these small acts of perfuming were not vanity. They were survival wrapped in fragrance. The streets bend again, narrower now, and your steps echo against the damp stones. A lantern flickers overhead, and beneath its glow, you glimpse another side of the story, how these women handled the aftermath of their trade when the body's secretions clung stubbornly, refusing to be ignored. You pause near a door cracked open, candlelight spilling across the threshold. Inside, a woman kneels beside a wooden basin. The water is cloudy, tinged faintly yellow, with strands of hair and grit floating on the surface. She isn't bathing, not in the way you'd imagine a bath. She dips a rag into the water and wipes herself quickly, focusing on thighs, underarms, and the folds of skin where sweat and other fluids gather. The rag is wrung out again and again, leaving damp trails across her body. This is her cleanse, brief and utilitarian, done in silence. Beside the basin sits a jug of vinegar. She splashes some onto the cloth, pressing it against her skin with a grimace. The smell stings your nostrils even from where you stand. Vinegar was believed to disinfect, to cut through the smells that no ordinary water could tame. Yet you can't help but think of the burning, the irritation, the soreness this must have caused. Still, in her world, the sting was a trade-off for feeling fresh. Some women went further, using wine or even urine as cleansing agents. Yes, urine, believed by some medieval folk to possess medicinal or purifying qualities. Historians still argue whether prostitutes relied on it for its supposed antiseptic value or simply because it was free and always available. The image of someone rinsing with what others discarded is jarring, but it speaks volumes about the resourcefulness required to survive in that time. There's a fringe detail here. Alum powder was sometimes sprinkled onto cloths before wiping down. Alum tightened skin and reduced odor, but it also caused dryness and cracking. Imagine going about your nightly work with patches of irritated skin, forcing a smile while enduring constant discomfort. That's the part history often glosses over, the quiet suffering hidden beneath ritual. You notice another detail: the rag itself isn't washed between uses. It's dried and reused, stiff with residue from past cleansings. The basin water is shared too, passed from one woman to another until it's more filth than cleanser. It feels like a cruel parody of hygiene, where every attempt to be clean only spreads more dirt. Yet strangely, there's laughter in the room. One woman complains that the vinegar makes her smell like a pickled herring. Another jokes that at least it might attract sailors. Humor becomes armor, the only way to endure practices that border on unbearable. As you watch, you can't help but reflect on the broader reality of the Middle Ages. Water was often distrusted, believed to spread disease, while vinegar and alcohol seemed safer. But without true understanding of germs, every cleansing act was a gamble. Sometimes relieving, sometimes harmful, rarely effective. The irony is sharp. The very methods meant to restore freshness may have worsened infections and spread illness faster. There's an odd sort of modern echo here. You think of today's endless market of scented wipes, sprays, and freshness products. So much of it's still about disguising the body rather than embracing it. Medieval prostitutes weren't so different. Their vinegar-soaked rags were the primitive ancestors of perfumed deodorants, both chasing the same impossible goal: to erase what the body naturally creates. You imagine the smell inside that room, vinegar sharp in the air, mingling with sweat, stale water, and herbs. The act is intimate, almost ritualistic, but stripped of luxury. It is survival in liquid form, a constant battle against the inevitable return of odor. As you step back into the night, one last thought lingers. In their hands, vinegar wasn't just condiment or cure, it was dignity in a bottle, however fleeting. And though you wrinkle your nose, you recognize the fierce humanity in the act. A quiet joke floats up. If life handed them lemons, they didn't make lemonade, they poured it straight into a basin and called it hygiene. Your footsteps echo again, leading you toward a darker stretch of the alley. The smells intensify, less vinegar now, more musk, sweat, and something uncomfortably sour. You realize that while some women tried to manage hygiene with cloths, herbs, and vinegar, others carried the traces of their trade openly. Picture this: a woman walks past you, skirts swaying, and the air shifts with her. The odor is not subtle. It clings like a heavy shawl, mixing layers of perfume, unwashed fabric, and the unmistakable tang of human intimacy. You might instinctively recoil, but then you think, this was her normal. Smell was as much a part of the medieval landscape as mud underfoot or smoke in the air. Odor wasn't just background, it was an identity marker. Prostitutes, often confined to their districts, became associated with the smell of those quarters. The brothel stench, a blend of sweat, wine, and stale bodies, was as distinctive as incense in a church. Some medieval writers mocked these women, describing them as walking fumes. Others admitted, with grudging honesty, that the scent was also strangely alluring, an unspoken advertisement carried on the breeze. Historians still argue whether medieval clients actively tolerated or even expected strong odor, or if they were simply resigned to it. Cleanliness was relative. If you only bathed once or twice a year, what counted as disgusting might be redefined downward. A whiff of vinegar might have been refreshing by comparison. Here's a fringe tidbit. Certain brothels deliberately burned pungent herbs or incense at their doorways, not for decoration but to mask the collective stench within. Rosemary, sage, and juniper were common. Imagine stepping into a chamber where sage smoke curls around the ceiling beams, trying, and failing, to hide the reality beneath. It's like spritzing cheap cologne over a week-old gym bag. But smell wasn't just about masking filth. Sometimes it carried warnings. A putrid odor might signal infection, syphilis, gonorrhea, or other diseases that spread unchecked. Physicians of the time believed illness could be sniffed out. A woman whose scent turned sour or metallic might be avoided, whispered about, or cast out by her madam. Odor became an invisible branding iron, marking her body as risky merchandise. There's an anecdote whispered among chroniclers. Clients sometimes carried pomanders, small metal balls filled with herbs and perfumes, held up to the nose while visiting prostitutes. The idea was twofold: to protect against bad air, what they thought spread disease, and to endure the overwhelming stench of a crowded, unwashed room. Imagine paying for company but holding a clove-stuffed orb to your face the entire time. Romance at its finest. And the women themselves? Many tried to fight odor with perfumes made from animal fats, flowers, or even rancid oils mixed with crushed petals. A dab at the throat, a smear on the wrists, and hope that it lasted through the night. Yet, under the heat of bodies, the perfume often soured, turning sweet into cloying, floral into rotten. Still, it was better than nothing. It's easy, from the comfort of your clean sheets tonight, to wrinkle your nose and laugh. But think of the layers. Poor diet, lack of clean laundry, constant sweating, venereal infections, cramped living quarters. Odor wasn't a flaw, it was a permanent companion. You didn't escape it, you adapted to it. One client's complaint from the 14th century survives in a sermon. He grumbled that prostitutes reek worse than tanneries. Another, more practical voice, retorted that at least their smell was less costly than incense. That bite of sarcasm feels oddly modern, like the medieval version of a customer review online. So as you drift along these streets, nose twitching, you realize smell defined the entire atmosphere of the trade. It was the unspoken language of hygiene, or its absence. Some scents warned you away, some enticed, some simply reminded you of humanity's messy, unavoidable reality. And tonight, as you sit there listening, maybe you catch yourself smiling at the absurd thought. Thank goodness YouTube hasn't invented smell-o-vision. If it had, you probably wouldn't survive this. The further you wander, the more you notice the quiet menace in the air. It isn't just about the stench or the grime anymore, it's about what happens when unwashed bodies become battlegrounds for disease. Prostitutes lived with this daily, long before antibiotics, long before soap was cheap, long before anyone understood germs. Picture yourself sitting in a smoky chamber, walls blackened by years of tallow candles. A woman coughs in the corner, another scratches at her skin until it bleeds, and someone nearby whispers about a neighbor whose nose has collapsed from the French disease. That was the polite euphemism for syphilis, which erupted in Europe at the end of the 15th century. It spread like wildfire, and brothels were accused of being its breeding grounds. But here's the kicker. Long before syphilis, medieval sex workers were already wrestling with other nasty infections. Gonorrhea, chlamydia, lice infestations, skin rashes. They were all familiar, though people didn't have the medical terms yet. Instead, they described symptoms with eerie poetry: the burning sickness, the red flow, the creeping itch. You can almost imagine them shrugging, resigned to a discomfort that came with the job. Historians still argue whether medieval authorities truly believed prostitutes contained disease by sacrificing their own health, or if that was just a moral excuse to tolerate the trade. Either way, the women's bodies became public dumping grounds for infection. If a client got sick, the blame rarely fell on him. Instead, the woman was accused of being unclean, as though she had manufactured the illness herself. Quirky tidbit: some brothel keepers thought wine could cure infection. They encouraged women to drink it daily, believing it purified the blood. Imagine swishing a goblet of sour red wine around your mouth like medieval mouthwash and hoping it will keep syphilis away. It didn't work, of course, but it probably made the nights a little more bearable. The church's response was equally baffling. Priests sometimes demanded infected women undergo penance instead of medical care. One account describes a prostitute forced to stand outside a cathedral, holding a candle as if she were the living embodiment of sin. The real tragedy? After her shaming ritual, she likely went straight back to work, untreated, because hunger trumped humiliation. Some midwives and wise women offered remedies: herbal baths, poultices of garlic and vinegar, ointments made with mercury. Yes, mercury. It burned the skin, sometimes leaving raw wounds, but people thought the pain meant the poison was drawing out disease. Modern medicine shudders at the thought, but in that moment, mercury seemed like hope in a jar. You pause for a second and imagine it: the sizzling sting, the metallic tang, the scars it left behind. And yet, women endured it because what choice did they have? Clean water wasn't readily available, hospitals were places of death rather than healing, and men kept coming night after night, coin in hand. There's another layer too: disease wasn't always invisible. Prostitutes sometimes wore makeup not just for allure, but to cover lesions or rashes. White lead powder could mask sores, though it poisoned the skin further. Rouge brightened cheeks that might otherwise look hollowed from illness. It was a performance of vitality, even when the body beneath was failing. And clients? Many didn't care. The thrill outweighed the risk. Some even believed sleeping with a prostitute could cure them of their own sickness, by transferring it to her. That cruel superstition condemned countless women to agony, while men congratulated themselves for walking away cleansed. So as you trace your path through these shadowed quarters, You realize hygiene wasn't just about stink or dirt. It was about survival. Disease shaped reputations, altered bodies, and decided who lived long enough to grow old. The women were frontline soldiers in an endless war against infection, though they never volunteered for the role. And here's the quiet irony. While the authorities railed against them as sources of corruption, it was often the neglect of those same authorities, failing to provide sanitation, refusing real medicine, that made their suffering inevitable. The women bore the burden, while the city kept profiting from the taxes on their trade. You exhale slowly, letting the image dissolve. The coughing, the scratching, the whispered gossip about bad blood. It all lingers in the air like smoke that refuses to clear. The further you drift into this twilight of memory, the more you sense another layer of grime that clung to these women, not just the filth on their skin, but the stench that never truly left them. Hygiene in the Middle Ages was already a losing battle for most people, but for prostitutes it was a full-blown tragedy. Think of the environment first. Medieval cities were not exactly what you'd call fresh-scented. Chamber pots were dumped out of upper windows, cesspits overflowed in the summer, and gutters carried a rank slurry of mud, urine, spoiled food, and animal offal. The smell was everywhere, so much so that visitors sometimes described entire towns as if they were vast latrines. Into this backdrop stepped the women who worked the streets or the cramped rooms of the city's brothels. Now, imagine trying to keep yourself even remotely fresh when water was both scarce and dangerous. Bathhouses did exist, but many were shut down by the late Middle Ages because the church feared they encouraged immorality. And yes, immorality usually meant too much naked mingling. Without those public baths, prostitutes often had no option but to freshen up with whatever was at hand. A rag dipped in cold rainwater, a handful of herbs rubbed under the arms, a splash of vinegar over the body to mask sour smells. Historians still argue whether the vinegar trick actually worked, or if it only added a sharper sourness to the air. But it was one of the most common hygiene hacks available. Think of it as the medieval version of deodorant, cheap, painful, and about as subtle as waving a pickle jar under your nose. Here's a quirky tidbit. Rosemary, lavender, and mint were favorites for masking odors, not because they were abundant in the city, but because they were associated with warding off bad air. People believed disease traveled through smells, so dousing yourself with herbs wasn't just cosmetic, it was a desperate attempt to stay alive. Picture a prostitute tucking sprigs of rosemary into her bodice, not for beauty, but as a kind of perfumed shield against unseen death. Still, there was no escaping the deeper truth. The body was a canvas of smells, and these women lived with layers upon layers. Sweat from endless encounters, lingering ale and garlic breath from clients, oil from unwashed hair, perfumed powders that clashed instead of covered, and yes, the raw scent of untreated infections. The result was a cocktail that no amount of lavender could conquer. And yet, remarkably, some brothels enforced their own odd hygiene rituals. There are records of certain madams requiring their girls to at least rinse their mouths with wine before clients arrived. Wine as mouthwash. It sounds almost glamorous until you remember the wine was sour, gritty, sometimes moldy. The purpose was less about freshening and more about disinfecting. Well, disinfecting in the medieval imagination. Clothing played a role too. Prostitutes often had to wear specific garments that marked their profession, and those clothes absorbed every odor imaginable. Without regular washing, because washing linen meant hauling water, soap was expensive, and boiling vats weren't easy to come by, the fabric became an extension of the body's stench. If you've ever forgotten your gym bag for a week, multiply that by months and add medieval sewage, and you're close to what these dresses carried. There's a strange paradox here. Clients complained about the stink, yet they kept coming back. Desire outweighed disgust. In fact, some scholars suggest that the very earthiness of prostitutes was eroticized in a world where noble women were kept scrubbed, perfumed, and distant. A scandalous thought, maybe the smell was part of the allure. And you, drifting deeper into this vision, realize something sobering. Stench wasn't just background noise, it was identity. The whore's smell became shorthand for sin in sermons and street gossip. Priests preached about the stench of vice, as if it were an actual cloud of sulfur trailing behind prostitutes. For the women themselves, there was no way to wash it off, because even if they bathed, the stigma lingered. Every breath they took carried the weight of that contradiction. To mask one stink with another. To walk through the streets branded by smell as much as by dress. To know that no amount of vinegar scrubbing or rosemary charms could erase what society already decided they embodied. And you pause, letting the air of that medieval alley fill your imagination. The staleness, the sharpness, the inescapable heaviness of unwashed flesh. the sound of rainwater dripping into a gutter. Somewhere nearby, laughter and coughing mingle, proving that even in the midst of overwhelming stench, life went on. As you move further into this grim landscape, the body itself becomes the battlefield. For prostitutes, hygiene wasn't just about smell or appearances, it was about survival in a world where the body was both a commodity and a curse. One of the most insidious problems they faced was lice. Head lice, body lice, even pubic lice, an entire kingdom of tiny invaders that thrived in unwashed fabrics and crowded rooms. It is said that prostitutes often carried fine-toothed combs not for styling hair, but for raking out these relentless pests. Picture the nightly ritual, sitting in dim candlelight, running a comb through tangled hair, picking at nits, flicking them into the fire. Yet no matter how often they combed, the vermin returned, a constant reminder that their flesh was never their own. Scabies and fleas were just as common. Brothels, with their heavy curtains and straw bedding, provided the perfect breeding grounds. Straw mattresses, never changed, absorbed sweat, urine, and semen, becoming living ecosystems of crawling things. Imagine lying down to work, while feeling a sharp bite on your thigh, knowing it wasn't from passion but from the thousands of fleas lurking in the straw beneath you. Then there was the skin itself. Without regular bathing, sweat and dirt clogged pores, leading to boils, rashes, and sores. Some women attempted to cover blemishes with powders made of lead or arsenic, a quick fix that slowly poisoned them over time. Pale, powdered skin might look alluring in the dim light of a tavern, but underneath the disguise, the body was breaking down. And this is where the true horror creeps in: disease. Not the quick, visible afflictions of lice or boils, but the slow-burning plagues of the flesh, syphilis and gonorrhea. In the Middle Ages, syphilis was often called the Great Pox, and its symptoms were terrifying. Open sores that refused to heal, ulcers eating into the nose and mouth, bones collapsing inward, reshaping the face into a mask of ruin. For prostitutes, this wasn't an abstract fear. It was an occupational hazard. Doctors of the time had little to offer. Mercury was the favored treatment, and so women would smear mercury ointment onto sores or even breathe in mercury vapors. The result? Drooling, rotting gums, missing teeth, and yet the disease still raged on. A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury, the saying went. A cruel reminder that both the disease and its cure left the body ravaged. And yet, incredibly, work did not stop. Women who carried sores, lesions, and missing teeth were still forced to sell themselves. Sometimes they disguised the worst symptoms with makeup or scarves. Sometimes clients didn't care. In a world where pleasure and poverty collided, survival outweighed disgust. Even worse were the infections caused by simple neglect. Urinary tract infections, yeast infections, and pelvic inflammations, conditions that today are easily treated, often became chronic, unbearable torments. Without antibiotics, what started as a burning discomfort could escalate into fever, infertility, or even death. But in the medieval world, the pain was endured silently, folded into the daily price of existence. And then there was childbirth. Many prostitutes became pregnant either by clients, by lovers, or by violence. The hygiene of childbirth was nightmarish. No sterile instruments, no washed hands, no clean linens. Midwives did their best with herbs and prayers, but many women died from infections we now call puerperal fever, caused simply by dirty hands delivering a baby. For prostitutes, whose lives were already precarious, giving birth could be the final toll. Think of it, the body as the very thing sold, yet also the very thing that betrayed them. Every sore, every itch, every fever was a reminder that their survival was bound to flesh that refused to stay clean or safe. And here lies the cruel irony. Medieval society condemned prostitutes for their filth, using their bodies as symbols of sin, while ignoring the fact that those bodies were trapped in a cycle of poverty, neglect, and abuse. The women weren't filthy by choice, they were filthy because the world left them no other option. You linger on this thought, and in the silence of your mind you hear the faint scratching of lice, the cough of someone infected, the muffled whimpers of a woman who has no medicine for her pain. The past does not smell of roses. It smells of bodies, rotting straw, and disease left untreated. And with that realization, the picture becomes clearer. Hygiene wasn't a detail of their lives, it was their prison. Now imagine the spaces themselves, those cramped and airless rooms where the women worked, ate, and sometimes even lived. Hygiene was not only about the body, but also about the walls and floors that surrounded it. And these spaces were every bit as unhygienic as the women's own flesh. The brothel room was a place of constant use. Straw mattresses rarely replaced, linens almost never washed. The same sheets would absorb the fluids of dozens of men in a single week, pressed again and again against the skin of the women who had no choice but to return to them. The smell alone must have been unbearable, a thick mixture of sweat, stale wine, smoke, blood, and sex. Floors were often little more than packed earth or rough wooden planks, littered with scraps of food, candle wax, and sometimes worse. Chamber pots overflowed. In some brothels, waste was simply tossed into the street below. Imagine lying in bed, trying to rest after hours of work, while the stench of sewage wafted through the thin shutters. Ventilation was poor. Candles and oil lamps filled the air with soot. In winter, fires smoldered in the hearth, coating walls in greasy black smoke. In summer, the rooms were hotboxes of infection, with flies crawling on every surface. Airborne diseases like tuberculosis and influenza found ideal conditions here. A single cough could spread through an entire house. Then there was water, or rather, the lack of it. Brothels seldom had wells of their own, so water had to be carried in buckets from public fountains or rivers. Clean water was precious and rarely wasted on scrubbing rooms or laundering sheets. Instead, it was saved for drinking, cooking, or, ironically, for diluting wine. As a result, filth simply accumulated, day after day, until the very walls became repositories of disease. Parasites flourished. Fleas and rats scuttled freely through brothels, bringing with them the constant threat of plague. The Black Death itself, spread by fleas from rats, had an especially cruel impact on prostitutes. In some towns, entire brothels were wiped out in a single season. Others continued working right through outbreaks, their services demanded even more desperately by men convinced that sex could be a cure for plague. Imagine the despair of a woman forced to open her door to coughing, feverish clients who carried death in their very breath. Even outside the brothel, the streets offered no relief. Medieval towns were filthy landscapes. Dung heaps steaming in alleyways, slaughterhouse waste flowing into rivers, chamber pots emptied from windows. Prostitutes who lived and worked in the poorest districts were surrounded by this squalor day and night. Walking to a client's house meant dodging streams of sewage, stepping over piles of rotting fish heads or animal guts, and inhaling the stench of unwashed humanity. Now think of how this environment shaped the women's own bodies. Every breath they took carried the dust of filth into their lungs. Every touch of the bed pressed fleas or lice into their skin. Every sip of water risked dysentery or worse. Cleanliness was not simply difficult, it was impossible. And yet, despite this, these spaces were painted as dens of pleasure and temptation. Moralists condemned prostitutes as creatures of vice, while conveniently ignoring the conditions that made true hygiene unreachable. To call these women unclean was to mistake cause for effect. They were unclean because they were forced to live in spaces designed for filth. When you picture this, you may see the irony. A man entering a brothel sought escape, pleasure, and perhaps a moment of comfort. What he found was a room soaked in years of sweat and disease, a mattress alive with vermin, a woman painted and perfumed to disguise the decay. Desire and disgust coexisted in the same space, inseparable, undeniable. And so, the brothel itself became both stage and trap, a theater of lust built on foundations of rot. You shuffle forward now into the crowded night, where another hazard lurks just as menacing as fleas or bad wine, clothing. Yes, the very garments prostitutes wore could be as unhygienic as the bodies that slipped in and out of them. A prostitute's dress was both her advertisement and her curse. Cities often required women of the trade to wear special colors, yellow hoods in Florence, striped cloaks in Venice, or rough linen veils in Paris, so clients could spot them instantly. But these garments, unlike the fine gowns of noble ladies, were seldom washed. Fabric was expensive, water scarce, and soap a luxury. Instead, prostitutes rewore the same stained and sweat-soaked clothes until the fabric itself seemed alive with grease and odor. Imagine a woolen gown that had absorbed candle smoke, spilled wine, and bodily fluids from countless encounters, then hung by the fire to dry without ever touching water. And underneath? Linens, if they had any, were rarely laundered. Most working women could not afford to change shifts daily, so underclothes were worn for weeks on end, collecting lice, scabies, and the itch of filth. Some women turned to powders, ground herbs, chalk, or even crushed lead, to dust themselves and mask smells, though this only added another layer of grime. Historians still argue whether prostitutes used perfume oils widely or if that was reserved for courtesans. What's clear is that whatever scent lingered, it mixed with sweat in ways you probably wouldn't bottle for Sephora. Shoes and stockings carried their own dangers. Streets were full of dung and refuse, and soft leather boots soaked it up. Prostitutes tracking muck into their rooms simply spread disease from outside to inside. Feet, rarely washed, developed sores that easily turned septic. One small cut in a filthy shoe could mean blood poisoning. Yet shoes were also tools of allure, dyed bright colors laced high on the calf, reminders that even decay had to look tempting. Then consider the symbolic filth. The clothing of prostitutes was not only literally dirty, it was socially marked as unclean. Writers mocked the rips in their gowns, the cheap silk stiff with sweat. Moralists declared their outfits stained by sin itself. Clothes carried stigma like a permanent odor. Once a garment was known as a prostitute's dress, even laundering could not wash away its shame. Quirky detail? Some women actually borrowed or rented outfits from wardrobe keepers who specialized in outfitting brothels. Imagine slipping into a gown still damp from the last woman's body heat, seams stretched by another shape, hem dragging in mud from someone else's night. Recycled clothing was practical, but revolting. And yet, paradoxically, clothes could also be a weapon of survival. A torn hem restitched, a ragged cloak dyed darker, a perfumed kerchief tucked into a bodice, all little tricks to mask poverty and filth. These women, resourceful as ever, turned even dirty garments into symbols of charm. So when you picture the medieval prostitute, don't imagine spotless silks shimmering in candlelight. Instead, think of coarse wool sticking to sweat, cheap dyes running in the rain, and hems dragging in dung. Each layer told a story, not of seduction alone, but of relentless, grinding uncleanliness woven into every thread. You edge deeper into the heart of this grimy labyrinth, and it becomes impossible to ignore the way bodies themselves carried the burden of filth. Hygiene in medieval Europe was already shaky, but for prostitutes, exposed constantly to contact, sweat, and strangers, bodily decay took on its own dreadful rhythm. Skin bore the first signs. Without regular washing, pores clogged with soot from smoky candles, grease from street food, and oils from constant touching. Pimples, boils, and rashes bloomed like second crops on arms and faces. A medieval proverb claimed that a whore's face shines by candle but rots by dawn, and you can imagine why. Flickering light could mask the blotches of infected skin, but daylight was merciless. To cope, women smeared on powders made of ground rice, chalk, or even crushed lead carbonate. That lead, of course, poisoned them slowly, eating away at their skin while giving it a ghostly pale mask. Historians still argue whether prostitutes were aware of the long-term risks or whether they simply accepted slow poisoning as the price of marketability. Hair told its own story. Lice thrived in tangled braids, crawling across scalps in relentless colonies. Combs were shared, never sanitized, so the pests spread from girl to girl. Some desperate women shaved their heads completely, then wore wigs or kerchiefs, though wigs themselves crawled with fleas. There's a quirky tidbit here. Certain brothels in Paris reportedly kept buckets of vinegar into which wigs were dunked between clients. Imagine the sharp sting of vinegar-soaked hair against skin already raw from scratching. Breath was another hazard. With rotten teeth and no dental care, halitosis clung to kisses. Chewing parsley or cloves was a common trick to freshen the mouth, but parsley doesn't erase years of decay. You can picture the clash: spiced wine masking sour teeth, sweet herbs fighting rancid gums. And in cramped brothels, every sigh carried that stale odor, thickening the very air. Feet too betrayed the strain. Constant walking through filth left them cracked and swollen. Fungus thrived between unwashed toes, creating itches that never went away. Some women smeared goose fat or pig lard onto their soles, a slippery salve against pain, though this only ensured they tracked grease across floorboards. Still, it was a desperate attempt at relief, and sometimes the only thing between them and an infected wound that could end a career. And then there was sweat, the omnipresent perfume of the body. Without regular bathing, sweat mingled with perfume oils, garlic-heavy meals, and wine. A prostitute's room in midsummer must have smelled like a strange stew of flesh, smoke, and rancid cloth. Scholars debate whether medieval people were truly nose-blind to this stench, accustomed as they were, or whether clients simply tolerated it in the fog of lust and drink. Either way, bodies themselves became landscapes of odor and irritation. The saddest detail? Many women aged faster than their years. Malnutrition, repeated infections, and constant exposure to filth carved lines into their faces and dulled their eyes. By 30, a prostitute often looked twice her age, her skin marked by scars of old sores, her teeth blackened stumps. No wonder brothel owners replaced women quickly, discarding those whose bodies no longer could disguise the filth. And yet, despite all this, survival required a performance. Women still painted their faces, perfumed their hair, adjusted their dresses, and smiled. They knew how to angle themselves in dim light, how to laugh to distract from missing teeth, how to flirt so that clients noticed curves instead of sores. In a world of grime, they turned their own bodies into stages, glittering in candlelight for just long enough to sell an illusion. So you picture it now, a body alive with parasites, scented with sweat and herbs, decaying in places no one speaks of, yet still presented with a grin, a wink, a practiced tilt of the chin. That's the true paradox. Unclean flesh transformed into currency, day after day. You've walked with them this far, and by now you can feel the claustrophobic press of their world. The final image waiting for you isn't the brothel room or the bustling market square. It's the way these women's bodies broke down under the relentless weight of poor hygiene, poor diet, and poor fortune. If you thought the smells and sores were grim, the long-term toll is even harsher. Bodies became brittle. Without regular baths, dirt layered into skin creases until infections took root. Ulcers festered on legs and arms, sometimes oozing pus so constantly that women wrapped themselves in rags that never truly dried. Imagine the quiet misery of carrying a wound that never healed, yet still having to smile at the door when a client walked in. One chronic condition, erysipelas, a bacterial infection causing fiery red swelling, was nicknamed the rose in brothels. A cruel irony, since it left women bedridden with fever, their skin burning as though lit from within. Their joints stiffened too. Malnutrition meant bones weakened, teeth loosened, and spines curved from constant bending and carrying. A prostitute might look spry on her stool, tossing her hair at passers-by, but under her skirts she limped, toes gnarled, knees swollen. The makeshift remedies, poppy seed mash for pain, wine as a constant anesthetic, did little more than dull the edges. Historians still argue whether some of these conditions were blamed on immorality itself, as if disease were punishment, rather than understood as preventable illness. The mind did not escape. Constant exposure to filth, ridicule, and disease chipped away at mental health. Medieval writers described prostitutes as merry or shameless, but you can sense the exhaustion behind that forced gaiety. Imagine insomnia in a flea-infested bed, the ceaseless scratching, the anxiety of wondering whether tonight's client carried the plague or just another rash. By middle age, if they survived that long, many were broken in body and mind, forgotten by the very towns that once profited from their labor. And yet, there were moments of resilience. Some women found solidarity, tending to each other's sores, sharing herbs, even laughing at the absurdity of their struggles. There are fringe accounts of brothel girls creating small beauty circles, where they passed around a single pot of rouge or helped braid lice-free strands into one another's hair. These fleeting acts remind you that even in squalor, humanity finds ways to sparkle, however faintly. The hygiene habits, so disgusting at first glance, become symbols of survival. They weren't just smearing rancid ointment for no reason, or rubbing garlic into sores because they liked the smell. They were improvising with what they had, clinging to life in a system designed to consume them. You might shudder at their lice-infested wigs or vinegar-soaked bedsheets, but you also have to admire their stubborn endurance. And so, the picture closes, a body covered in powders, bruised by years, yet still stepping into the candlelight night after night. The stench doesn't fade, the parasites don't vanish, but the performance continues. You have followed them from the public baths to the cramped beds, through the remedies, the disguises, and the decay. What's left now is silence, the sound of a woman finally closing her eyes after a day of surviving filth and men alike. And now let's slow everything down. You've walked through narrow streets, peeked into dimly lit rooms, and felt the weight of a world long gone. It was crowded, noisy, and often unbearably foul, but that chapter has ended, and you don't need to carry the smell or the shadows with you any further. Let them drift away like smoke from a snuffed candle. Take a long, easy breath. Imagine washing your hands in cool, clean water, water that runs clear, endlessly, something medieval people could hardly dream of. Let it run over your fingers, over your wrists, rinsing away the grime of centuries. With every slow inhale, picture yourself stepping back from those rooms, back from the noise, until all you hear now is the quiet hum of your own space. You've listened to stories of bodies breaking down, but yours right now is at rest. Feel the softness beneath you. Notice the rise and fall of your chest, steady as a tide. There's nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to go. Just let your mind float as gently as a feather in a breeze. The women you met tonight lived in harshness, but their stories are finished. Yours continues, and it unfolds in a gentler world. Allow their echoes to fade into the distance. Keep only the reminder that comfort, warmth, and safety are yours tonight. So as your eyes grow heavier, let each detail soften. The streets blur, the candles dim, the voices quiet. The story dissolves into stillness. Sleep is waiting, calm and forgiving, ready to wrap you in its embrace. Drift there now without hurry, without worry.